In the spring of 1806, when the longleaf pines shook out yellow ghosts and the rice water turned mirrors into graves, a letter rode the coast road that should never have been written. It arrived at the red house with the white columns and the black truth beneath it, the one locals called the Gideon Place, because men liked to name things after themselves when they were trying to hide what they did inside. That letter, sealed with green wax and a vanity crest, contained a proposal dressed as a trial. It spoke of lineage and improvement, as if people were cattle and kinship a hinge you could force until it broke. The women in the washyard didn't see the letter, but they felt its draft. You know how some papers can chill a county before they're ever read aloud? This was that paper. Before we open it, do one thing for me. If you're listening in a car where the road hums like a warning, or in a room that knows your name when you whisper, subscribe and ring that bell. Stories like this, buried by money, by shame, by the tidy lies of courthouse records, deserve daylight. Tell me where you're listening from so I know where the truth is traveling tonight. The man of the house, Elias Gideon, liked measurements. He measured yields in barrels, bodies in coin, silence in obedience. He kept a book for each. He believed the Low Country could be perfected if you trimmed away the parts that reminded you it was alive. That spring he added a fourth book, bound in eelskin, to track what he called outcomes. He would not say the word that belonged there. People who plan terrible things rarely do. Two cousins worked the northern paddies, knees in the water that sucked at you if you stood still too long. Ruth and Tamar, same grandmother, same songs, different faces that shared a jawline like an oath. They'd grown up in neighboring cabins, traded braids, traded stories, traded turns carrying the feverish when the swamp heat made lungs forget commands. They were kin by blood and by choice, the only kinship that matters when the world steals your name. No one told them why the overseer had started watching their row with a hawk's attentiveness and a vulture's hope. Aunt Mercy, midwife, root woman, keeper of the words the county tried to starve, felt the turn before anyone said it out loud. She said the marsh sounded wrong at night, like a choir forced to sing in a key that hurts. She ground sassafras and willow and tucked them into paper twists for headaches that were not headaches at all. She touched the earth by the smokehouse and felt it push back. Something wicked wants an arithmetic of the womb, she told the kettle, because kettles keep secrets if you feed them enough steam. You could taste the plan in the air the day the letter was opened. The house went quiet in the way places do before a storm chooses a roof. The overseer, Pike, had a new cruelty in his pocket, loud as a coin. He unfurled the terms the way men unroll maps of land they've never walked. Selection, he said. Trial. Result. Words with edges sounded so smooth they slid right into the ledger without making a sound. They summoned Ruth and Tamar to the big house under the pretense of inventory. We won't detail what was said in that study, some rooms are best described by what the air refused to carry. We will say this, the cousins didn't sit. They remained standing, hands at their sides, and watched the window instead of the men. The river beyond it moved like a thought you're not ready to think. Tamar counted swallows. Ruth counted her breaths. Aunt Mercy stood in the yard, pretending to search for mint, and listened through the floorboards with the soles of her feet. When she heard the word trial, she pressed her heel into the earth so hard a line of ants changed course. What the paper proposed was dressed in silk language, a scientist's lie sewn with a planter's pride, a forcing. An arrangement that treated bloodlines like ropes you could splice for strength. The House called it improvement. The law had no word for it except silence. Silence, in 1806, was a tool sharper than any knife. The nights that followed did not begin, they arrived, like weights. The quarters heard the plan in the small ways first, a lock added to a door that had never had one, Pike's whistle moving later in the dark, the dogs tied further from the house, like you do when you don't want witnesses that don't lie. The cousins moved like people who refuse to break in the places they can still choose. They didn't speak of the plan because naming a storm can pull it closer. But Ruth started sleeping with her boots on. Tamar tucked a ribbon of blue cloth under her tongue before she lay down, a trick Aunt Mercy taught to keep your name from being stolen in your sleep. Aunt Mercy began to stitch. Not clothes, paths. She sewed routes into memory with needle and whisper. 5 turns to the old levee, 3 to the fallen oak, past the stump that looks like a bent man praying. If the world presses you into a shape you can't live in, she told the cousins, you don't become that shape. You become a door. She mixed herbs that soothe and herbs that steady, none that erase. We don't forget, she said. Forgetting is how men like Gideon win twice. In the kitchen yard, a boy named Isaac practiced holding breath under a tub while the older men counted with their eyes closed. If a man can stay under long enough, he can cross a creek without rippling the truth. The women, pretending to discuss laundry, practiced the sequence of knocks that would open Aunt Mercy's cabin when the moon was wrong and the dogs were listening. Practice is hope with work clothes on. On the third dusk after the letter, the river struck the bank with the flat hand of fate. A thunderhead rolled in from the sea, wearing lightning like jewelry. The house shutters didn't close quite tight, light leaked around the edges like a guilty secret. Inside, Gideon set out his eelskin book and sharpened a quill, hand steady, the way a man's hands are steadied by the lie he is paid to believe. Outside, Aunt Mercy lit a second lamp, then a third, signals folded into normal. Ruth and Tamar stood in the doorway of their cabin and did what the living do when they sense a border crossing. They looked at each other long enough to memorize the map of a face they loved. If you're still with me, then you know, we don't have to show the wound to tell the truth about the knife. This is a haunting, not a spectacle. We keep our camera where dignity lives. Morning wore a stranger's face. The river looked the same, but the yard was rearranged by hidden orders. A bench moved 2 feet to the left, a pail hung higher than a tall man's reach, a door that never latched now latched twice. Aunt Mercy saw the pattern like a weaver sees flaws. She followed it into the kitchen, where a list had been tacked low, as if it belonged to the floor, and was, therefore, no one's business. The list was not inventory. It was a timetable disguised as chores. Names without surnames. Times without clocks. Ruth. Tamar. Separate lines. Linked destinies. She folded the paper into her apron and later fed it to the stove while the pot crackled approval. That day, the quarters practiced endurance. Not the kind that breaks you slow, the kind that makes you light enough to slip through a needle's eye. Isaac learned the hoofbeats of each horse by ear. Jonah, old field hand with a back like a question mark, walked the fence line counting slats and, where numbers didn't match memory, he planted a pebble in the post hole to mark deceit. Tamar plaited her hair tight and tucked the blue ribbon beneath the braid. Ruth took off her boots and stood barefoot in the yard until the ground cooled her anger into something sharper and safer, resolve. They were adults, fully grown women with old scars and quick minds, but adulthood is no shield when a house decides to bend you. Mercy measured herbs with a midwife's respect, nothing to numb, everything to steady. I won't dull you, she told them. You need all your edges. She gave them tea that made hands stop shaking and a tonic that made sleep, when it came, deeper than fear. No forgetting, she reminded, touching each forehead with ash from the stove. We remember to stay human. The overseer, Pike, tried a smile that didn't fit his face. He began using phrases he'd learned from Gideon's books, flinging them like polished stones. Improvement. Observation. Selection. He kept the dogs closer, not for protection, but for spectacle. The hounds watched him the way the river watches a drowning man, without promise. Gideon wrote in the eelskin ledger with a fine hand. He did not write words like harm. He wrote numbers that pretended not to bleed. The house staff learned to announce themselves before entering his study, as if knocking could make a thing lawful. The cousins learned to talk in weather. Looks like rain meant don't be alone. Winds up meant meet me at Mercy's after dark. Air feels heavy meant hold my hand if you can without anyone seeing. That evening, Mercy laid out 3 chords on her table. Paths, she said. One chord was short and knotted close, fight here, now, with what we have. One chord was long and smooth, run tonight and never look back. The last was spliced, 2 lengths joined by careful, visible work. This one, Mercy said, tapping the splice, is the path where we turn their counting into our measure. We keep the record they keep, only ours is true. We make their ledger lie to itself. Ruth touched the splice. Tamar nodded, eyes dry as flint. The plan was not a single act. It was a choreography of refusals: never be where the timetable expects, never respond to a whistle with speed, never give a man the mercy of your fear. They leaned on each other the way boats lean at dock, subtle, constant, keeping both from splitting in the swell. The first small victories were invisible to anyone who doesn't live in a body that must resist for breakfast: a lock that stuck at the right moment, a door that creaked loud enough to scare a rat-faced clerk into backing away, a dog that chose to watch the moon instead of a doorway. That night the storm's edge arrived, thunder stalking the tree lean, lightning teasing the copper on the roof. Mercy hung 3 onions from her lintel and chalked a sign over the door that meant, in a language older than Gideon's money, "Come through me clean or not at all." She sat, needle in hand, sewing a simple shirt with stitches so even a judge would trust them. "We will not be made spectacle," she said to the shirt. "We will tell our own version, and it will be the only one worth hearing." Days turned into a string of taut threads. If you plucked one, the whole line sang. Gideon's handwriting grew more ornate as if flourish could make theory behave. He summoned a physician from Charleston who smelled like cloves and compromise. The man inspected rooms instead of people, peered at windows for drafts, then complimented the house on its clean principles. He nodded at the oilskin ledger like a fellow priest. Mercy watched his shadow shrink as the sun moved. "He's been practicing believing himself," she muttered, "since before he learned to read." Pike reorganized the dog run, moving the hounds to the far side of the carriage shed. He told everyone it was for shade. The truth, the dogs had begun to look past him, toward the quarters, as if saving their attention for what mattered. Isaac took to walking by their pen at dusk, hands open, voice quiet. He never fed them, Pike would notice. He gave them what a starving heart can't refuse: recognition. The oldest hound, a brindled thing with a torn ear, pressed his head against the fence when Isaac spoke. Names make bridges where fences stand. In the quarters, the women convened under the pretense of shelling peas. The rhythm of thumbs on pods became code. 3 quick pops meant listen. A pause meant danger hunting near. Tamar, who carved small miracles from scraps, spoons that fit hands, combs that didn't break hair, made tokens from cypress slivers: a crescent for wait, a star for go, a tiny house for gather. She slipped them into palms like prayers. Ruth composed the counterledger Mercy had promised. Not with ink, the house could burn paper. With memory and place. Each fact was stitched to a landmark. On the day the wisteria bloomed out of season, Pike moved the latch. When the heron nested on the rice post with the broken nail, they changed the hour. When the cornbread tasted like ash, the doctor arrived. This is how people without permission write history, in constellations of the ordinary, which the powerful never think to erase. Gideon sent letters by private courier, riding out at odd hours to the river landing. The courier wore a blue coat even in heat and never spoke above a whisper, as if words issued receipts. Mercy started leaving bundles of mint and feverfew near the landing's back path, a hint that someone watched. Gideon stepped on them without looking. Men who believe the world is their hallway rarely check for witnesses. When the first of the observations was scheduled, the air itself refused to move. Heat lay over the fields like a decree. The timetable, revised twice that morning, slid under Mercy's door by a boy with eyes full of apology. Ruth unfolded it, then folded it back the wrong way so the crease broke the printed lines. "Good," she said. "Let it never lie flat again. We will not catalogue the indignities the paper demanded, they are known to history and do not need our voice to breathe. Instead, we will place our attention where the house refused to look. On Tamar's decision to step between Ruth and a doorway, not with drama but with the weight of a person who knows her own spine. On Ruth's steady gaze at the window, counting swallows again, refusing to be present in a room that tried to take her apart. On Mercy's kettle, which clicked at precise intervals, a sound like someone knocking from the other side of a wall, reminding the living that witnesses can be made from steam. Pike waited for disorder the way a bully waits for tears. When none came, when the cousins moved like a tide refusing to be scheduled, he lost a sliver of himself he'd never get back, the certainty that other people's bodies were tools. He tried to tighten the net. The net learned the shape of his hands and slipped. That night, as lightning stitched the horizon to the field, Mercy laid a map of the property on her table. The map wasn't on paper. It was a braided cord with beads tied in at distances only she understood. Here, she said, touching a blue bead near a knot, is the place where the dogs forget to listen to Pike. And here is where the ground remembers being river. She held the cord so its weight pulled like a story too heavy to tell all at once. We will move on the night the storm begins talking to itself. The first rumor arrived in a barrel of rice. The barrel had a dark streak where damp kissed grain and left a mark like a finger drawn through flour. The mark told anyone fluent in the dialect of storerooms, the flood line from last year's late tide still haunted the wood. This house doesn't believe in what the water remembers, Jonah said, tapping the stain. Mercy nodded. Then we'll let the water teach. She began to collect small disobediences from the yard, clumps of half-fermented rice that smelled like bread remembering wine, handfuls of marsh salt that bit the tongue in a way sugar never could, moss that listened. She did not poison, her rage was not chemical. She curated moods. A pinch of the damp rice in a cook's hand meant grip the ladle tighter when certain eyes watched. A dusting of marsh salt on the step meant don't sit, keep moving. In the doctor's teacup, Mercy placed nothing but a look, one he felt in his bones. My practice is sound, he told Gideon, suddenly unsure why his mouth practiced the sentence twice. Sound, of course, can be a verdict or an alarm. Ruth taught Isaac the art of absence. Stand where you can be seen, she said, until seeing you becomes a habit. Then, when you need it, stand where you can't be. Isaac practiced in the cane brake, stepping in and out of sight while Tamar counted under her breath, 1, 2, gone. Mercy watched them and thought of all the ways children have had to learn games that weren't games. Gideon's letters multiplied. He began using a different seal, red wax instead of green, stamped with a crest the quarters didn't recognize. When a seal changes, a promise changes. Ruth, who had become a connoisseur of the house's paper lies, felt her stomach go cold. He found an audience, she told Mercy. He's rehearsing for men who clap in rooms no one should stand in. Pike scheduled demonstrations, as if lives could be demonstrated. He brought in 2 planters from upriver with eyes like shutters. They walked the grounds and commented on drainage and discipline with equal expertise. Tamar overheard one of them praise Gideon's innovative inquiry, the way some men praise a clever plow. She carried that praise like a splinter until night, then pushed it out with a needle sterilized in the flame of her own fury. Mercy wrote to a woman named Hester 3 plantations over, folding the letter into a loaf delivered by a mule that pretended to be old. Hester was a midwife too, with scars of her own and a city's worth of news in her head. The reply came tied under the mule's belly. The talk is spreading, Hester wrote. But so is your story. There are ears that do not belong to them. The nights lengthened, fattening with thunder. On the 5th night of watching lightning without rain, Mercy gathered the women in her cabin. I don't ask for bravery, she said. I ask for precision. She spread the braided cord map across her lap. On the sign, the one only the river gives, Ruth will be at the lower yard, Tamar at the wash house, Isaac with the dogs, Jonah at the fence, me by the cellar door. We do not make a scene. We make a seam. We unsew what they stitched. Tamar spoke softly, the first time she'd let heat into her voice since the letter. If this fails? Mercy met her eyes. Then we choose which door to be. But hear me, we are not the trial. We are the witnesses. We are the ledger that cannot be burned. The doctor returned with a box of instruments that glinted like excuses. He unpacked them on a cloth so white it looked like denial. Gideon discussed variables while Pike stood at the window and watched the dog pen as if animals might mutiny. The doctor scribbled notes that said nothing plainly and everything cruelly, in the way of men who rely on vocabulary to make harm sound clever. Mercy met the doctor on the porch without asking permission. She handed him a cup of water and the look she kept for wolves that had learned manners. "You ever seen a river change its mind?" she asked. He blinked. "Rivers follow their channels." "Until they don't," Mercy said, and tipped the rest of the water onto the steps where it found a crack and disappeared into the house's bones. Inside, Ruth and Tamar turned the room into a geometry the men could not solve. They stood where shadows made lines across the floor and refused to move when instructed to stand here. They were not stubborn, they were mathematicians of harm, refusing the angle that aimed to split them. Pike's jaw worked. Gideon's quill paused. The doctor dabbed his temple with a cloth that smelled like cloves and impatience. Isaac walked to the dog pen with a strip of blue cloth wrapped around his wrist. The torn-eared hound watched him with the attention given to a person who has never lied to you. Isaac spoke quietly about ordinary things, the taste of last year's first peach, the way the stable door creaked on cold mornings, the frog that lived in Mercy's bucket for a week and refused to leave even when the water heated. He told the dog a story of staying, and the animal believed him. The demonstration never completed itself. Doors misbehaved, candles guttered, a window latch refused to catch, and a wind rose that smelled like rain on iron. Gideon wrote furiously as if ink could wrestle the night back into obedience. The doctor fussed with an instrument until it became a toy in his hands. Pike tried to reorder the room by sheer volume and learned that yelling at silence only proves which one of you has more practice. When the visitors left, they did not look at the cousins. They congratulated Gideon on his resolve and complimented the doctor on his method. Mercy watched their carriage lights bob down the road like fireflies that had lost faith. In the dark, Jonah smiled without teeth. "The show went on," he said, "but the stage knew who it belonged to." That night, a sound threaded the quarters, a bell no one had rung. It came from the river, or the trees, or the part of a place that refuses to be owned. It rang 3 times and then once more, offbeat. Mercy stood, eyes closed, counting. "That's the sign," she whispered. The water changed its mind. The storm arrived walking on its knuckles. Thunder crouched low, the air an animal that didn't recognize its name. This is when the low country tells you its oldest story, that anything built too straight will snap when the wind remembers how to speak. Gideon barred the shutters and brought the eelskin ledger to the parlor as if keeping arithmetic near would steady God's weather. He called for Pike and the housekeeper and the doctor. He did not call for Mercy. Mercy did not wait to be called. In the quarters, the women braided scarves around their heads and tied aprons tight. Ruth and Tamar stood in the doorway of Mercy's cabin while she drew 3 circles with ash on the floor. "Step into the first," she told them. "Say your name to yourself and to anyone listening who means you well." They did. "Step into the second. Say what was done to you without describing it." They did. "Step into the third. Say what you refuse." The room warmed. Outside, lightning stitched the rice fields to the sky. The river, bored with its banks, lifted itself a little and looked around. Isaac slipped through the dark to the dog pen, hand steady. He unlatched the gate without opening it, then looped a rope through in a way that looked secure to anyone rushing past. The torn-eared hound stood and pressed his weight to the gate just enough to feel it give and then settle. He lay down again. Trust has a scent. Tonight it smelled like wet bark and a boy telling the truth. Pike, drunk on adrenaline and borrowed authority, decided to check the quarters. He walked with a lantern that hissed disapproval in the wind. At Mercy's door, he didn't knock. He stepped in and found ash circles and women who did not move. He opened his mouth to speak and swallowed ash by accident. His words came out tasting like the inside of a stove. "You're done when I say," he managed. Mercy rose, not quickly but with the gravity of someone who knows where she belongs. "We're done," she said, "when the river does, and the river is older than you." He raised a hand as if to push the air out of his way. The lantern guttered, recovered, went out. In the second of dark that followed, 3 things happened. Ruth took Tamar's hand, Isaac pulled the dog gate wide and whispered go, and the storm turned its face toward the house. Wind works fast when it finds a story worth finishing. The shutter on the east side tore loose and banged like a cannon. Gideon shouted for Pike, for nails, for order. The doctor tried to cover the eelskin ledger with his body, as if rain reads. It does. Rain reads very well. The dogs slipped from their pen-like intentions, freed from explanations. They didn't run wild, they ran precise. Not at people, not at first. They circled the yard, noses high, mapping panic. The torn-eared hound found Pike's scent and stopped, head cocked, as if to say, "The order is wrong tonight." Isaac stood in shadow, one hand open, breathing the rhythm Mercy had taught him, a tied count. In out, hold. He whispered the hound's name, the one only the animal knew. Mercy moved through the house as if she had keys. She didn't touch the ledger, she touched the table under it, found the wobble in the leg Gideon refused to acknowledge, wedged a sliver of wood, and then, when the storm rocked the wall, the ledger slid and fell into her apron like a confession rescuing itself. She did not keep it. She turned and pressed it into Ruth's hands, then into Tamar's, so it would learn the feel of the people it forgot to count, and then she tucked it into the hollow behind the kitchen hearth where mice keep their families safe. "Tell the truth later," she said to the book. "Tonight you keep quiet." Ruth and Tamar moved as planned, one to the wash house to light the lamps Mercury had placed, one to the lower yard to stand where Pike would expect emptiness. The lamps did not signal panic, they signaled witness. Pike came around the corner fast, saw light where he wanted darkness, and hesitated. In that beat, the torn-eared hound stepped between Pike and the wash-house door and looked up at him the way a mirror looks at a liar. "We will not pretend the storm made saints of men." Pike reached for his whip and found air. The wind took his hat the way a judge takes a gavel. He swore at the sky and took 2 steps back without admitting it. Isaac's voice threaded the space between them. "Easy," he said, not to Pike. To the hound. The animal lowered its head just enough to consider options. Mercy's voice, from the porch, braided into Isaac's. "You see, old boy," she said to the dog. "The hand that fed you salt wants you to forget the hand that fed you truth." Gideon, drenched and furious, appeared with nails and a hammer and the belief that would obeys. "Get them inside," he shouted at Pike, meaning the cousins, as if anyone belongs indoors when a storm wants the house. Lightning found the copper on the roof and made a white photograph of everyone's face for 1/6 second. In that flash, Ruth and Tamar stood exactly where the timetable declared they could not be. History will try to erase this sentence, but I will write it anyway. They did not flinch. The storm cracked something that wasn't wood. The house exhaled 20 years of secrets and the yard inhaled courage it had been saving. Women came from cabins under the illusion of checking on children, carrying buckets that could hold water or resolve. Jonah shuffled to the fence post where he'd planted a pebble months ago and pressed his thumb into the dirt as if closing a book. Now, he told the earth. Mercy stepped into Gideon's path with her hands empty. "Call them by their names," she said. He tried to shoulder past. She didn't move. The doctor hovered, a man who wanted to be on the right side of a door the world kept moving. "I will send for a magistrate," he blurted, as if law could stand up in this weather. Mercy looked at him gently. "Send for a river while you're at it," she said. "Tell it to unlearn the moon." Pike lunged toward the wash house and the torn-eared hound matched him step for step, not biting, not barking, just insisting, with a body made to run, that he had chosen the wrong direction. 2 more hounds joined, not a pack, a parliament. Isaac had his palm open, the blue cloth dark with rain. He breathed, drawing out the word until it became a place and not a command. The hounds glanced at him and returned their gaze to Pike as if to say, "He remembers us, do you?" Gideon shouted for order and got thunder in reply. He grabbed for the eelskin ledger as if snatching a child from a flood and found only table. Panic punched him in the throat. For men like Gideon, the loss of a book hurts worse than their own blood. He spun, saw Mercy's apron dark and heavy, and reached. Mercy lifted her chin. "You kept count," she said, "and your counting made you blind." Behind her, the hearth breathed hot. The ledger was safe as secrets ever are, not very, but enough. The yard tilted toward a choice. The doctor, rain-drowned, put a hand on Pike's arm in the first brave thing he'd ever done. "Let it go," he said, and Pike, too surprised to be enraged, paused. The hound took that pause and deepened it into a path. He turned, trotted to Isaac, pressed his head into the boy's belly, and whined exactly once, a note that meant "I know." Ruth stepped forward. "No more," she said. Tamar stepped beside her. "No more," she repeated. They weren't pleas. They were declarations stamped into the night with the authority of weather. Mercy stood with them. Jonah stepped up on the other side, leaning on his question mark back like a punctuation marking the end of a paragraph built of years. The women in the yard lifted their buckets, not to throw, but to hold, as if cupping the moment's face, keeping it from slipping away. Gideon saw it then, the math he could not solve. He saw that the house had decided to belong to its true owners, the living and the storm. He opened his mouth to command and drank a mouthful of rain and silence instead. A hinge inside him rusted. When the worst of the wind passed, the rain stayed like a witness who refuses to be dismissed. The yard reassembled itself, buckets hanging steady from hands that no longer shook, dogs standing wet and certain, the house sagging with the blessed fatigue of a place that has chosen honesty over posture. Mercy took the eelskin ledger from the hearth's hollow while the doctor stared at the fire as if expecting it to testify. She did not open the book. She wrapped it in oilcloth and tied it with a strip of blue ribbon, the color of a promise you don't say out loud. "This isn't ours to keep," she told Ruth and Tamar. "It's ours to place. Somewhere it can't be altered, somewhere it must be found by someone who expects to be changed." Tamar named a place with her eyes, the old levee, the one the river abandoned when it got bored being obedient. Ruth nodded. Isaac volunteered without words, pointing at his chest. "Not tonight," Mercy said. "When the moon is empty." Pike retreated to the carriage shed under the excuse of checking tack. The hounds followed Isaac to the quarters and lay down under Mercy's table, sighing in the way animals do when a story ends well enough for sleeping. Gideon disappeared into his study and closed the door with a smallness none of them had heard from him before. The doctor wrapped his instruments and, finding himself suddenly human, asked Mercy where he could be useful. She handed him a mop. He took it as if he'd been handed a sacrament. The storm's edge ripped away at last and the night cooled. Stars stuttered back on one by one, blinking like people coming to. Jonah sat on the stoop and took off his shoes, dumping water and a pebble into his palm. "We'll need this," he told Mercy. "For remembering where the fence used to lie. In the quiet that follows survival, wounds start talking. Not the fresh ones, the old ones that waited their turn." Mercy brewed tea that tasted like forgiveness without erasure. She passed cups and did not ask questions that would put definitions on what the house tried to enact. "We say harm," she told the cousins, "and the whole world knows the rest. Our mouths are for vows now." The doctor cleared his throat, the sound of a man unlearning his credentials. "I can write," he offered, gesturing to the space between himself and them. "Not like that ledger," he added quickly. "I can write a letter that says a storm broke your roof and ruined your papers and that your records must be reconstructed later." Mercy nodded. "You'll write the weather's truth then," she said. It broke what needed breaking. Days after the storm, the yard wore repair like a medal. Shutters rehung at angles that made more sense. The dog pen rebuilt with a gate that latched and unlatched without lies. Gideon moved softer, but softness is not sainthood. He searched for the eelskin ledger at dawn, at noon, at midnight, like a man looking for his shadow. Mercy set the counterledger in motion. She gathered the names of those who had watched, those who had spoken up, those who had stood still at exactly the right time. She etched them not into paper but into practice. The cook learned to count heads at mealtimes out loud, a roll call woven into grace. The field boss, who had always been gentler than the job allowed, began to bungle Pike's orders in ways that couldn't be proven deliberate. Isaac, now allowed near the house for chores, let the hounds choose their routes. They often chose to ignore voices that didn't know theirs. At night, Mercy, Ruth, and Tamar walked to the old levee with the wrapped ledger. The moon was a fingernail, the river a rumor. They found the place where the water used to climb and dig its heels. There, Mercy lifted a flat stone and revealed a cavity lined by roots that looked like hands. "Put it in," she told the cousins. They did, palms steady. "If the world is fair one day," Mercy said, "someone will open this. If it isn't, the river will eat it. Either way, it won't belong to him anymore." On the way back, they passed the stump that looked like a bent man praying. Tamar stopped, touched it, and whispered, "Stand." In the morning, the stump looked less like a prayer and more like a person about to rise. Gideon convened a meeting. Present, himself, Pike, the doctor, the housekeeper. Absent, the ledger. He declared the trial suspended pending reconstruction of records, and loaded the words with enough self-importance to feel like mercy. The doctor kept his eyes down and said nothing that betrayed the truth, that a tide and a woman took the book and kept it from becoming scripture. Pike offered to increase patrols, to send the hounds to the quarters, to remind people of obedience. Gideon surprised him. "No," he said. "Let the house be quiet. Quiet will make them forget the storm." He didn't know he had misread the entire point of weather. Quiet can be a cradle or a coffin. Mercy chose cradle. She taught kids to trace the path from quarters to levee with their toes, eyes closed, counting fence posts between like piano keys. She showed the women how to carry messages in the way they held laundry baskets. Tilted left meant hurry, tilted right meant hide, straight meant safe. Ruth and Tamar repaired a dozen things Gideon never noticed broken: the hinge on Mercy's chest, the loose plank near the well, the split in Isaac's sleeve. Care is a kind of fortification. Pike chose coffin. He went brittle. He began sleeping with his boots on and his whip coiled under his pillow. He walked the yard at angles, as if the ground had become a set of trapdoors. The hounds, once his shadow, tolerated him the way rain tolerates roofs. One afternoon, he raised his hand to cuff Isaac for standing in a doorway he suddenly wanted empty. The torn-eared hound stood between them before Pike's hand finished its sentence. He froze, discovering that being seen by a creature you thought beneath you can feel like being measured by a judge. "Back," he snarled, and his voice cracked on the word. The dog did not move. Gideon tried to host guests again. Men came with talk of yields and politics, and a war some were convinced they could forecast like weather. They drank and laughed and said the word storm the way people say bad luck. No one praised innovation. No one mentioned trials. Gideon smiled at the right times and poured more wine than he drank. He had started hearing the river at night like a sermon. One evening, the doctor returned alone with a strange humility in his suitcase. He asked Mercy for permission to visit her cabin. "Not as a physician," he said quickly. "As a student." Mercy poured him tea without flattery. "I can teach you how not to make harm sound clever," she said. "But you have to practice stopping when your tongue tries to impress the devil." He nodded like a man leaving a fence he'd built around himself. In the dark between midnight and morning, someone set the hound gate open. Not Isaac. Not Mercy. The dog with the torn ear slipped out and lay on the porch at the main house, head on paws, looking at the door. When Gideon opened it, he found himself face to face with a creature that remembered kindness from a boy and betrayal from a man and chose neither. The hound blinked rain out of his eyes though the sky was clear. Gideon stepped back and, for once, did not order anything to happen. Time pushed the story forward because that is what time does when people choose to live. The ledger at the levee rested in its root-lined cradle. The counterledger grew, names stitched to landmarks, facts catalogued in the archive of breath. The trial never resumed. Gideon found reasons that sounded like prudence and felt like fear. The doctor sent for a different career in a town less damp. Pike tried to leave and discovered the road looked longer when no one believed him important. Ruth learned to read from a hymn book with most of the good pages missing. Tamar learned to write with a stick in sand and gave the stick to a child who wrote their name like a victory. Isaac taught the hounds to sit for anybody who said please. Jonah died with his hands folded over the pebble he'd kept since the night the fence moved. Mercy washed him with tears she didn't apologize for and put the pebble under the headboard of her bed, so the next dream would have something solid to rest on. One night years later, when the river rose from a storm not worth naming, the levee gave up its secret to a boy fishing for anything that shines. He pulled on oilcloth, blue ribbon, eelskin. He didn't open it. He brought it to his mother, who brought it to Mercy, who held it like a book and a baby at once. "Not yet," she said, and tucked it under the church floorboards, beneath the pew where the women sat with their troubles and their amens. Whispers traveled the county like heat, the Gideon place had turned gentle without saying sorry. Some believed it. Others waited. Mercy did not let the story die. On winter nights, she told the children a version they could carry without burning their hands. There was a house that tried to measure what cannot be measured, and the storm taught it to count correctly. Ruth and Tamar aged into women whose laughter startled birds. They married men who knew the value of quiet and built a cabin with windows that faced east, where sun arrives first. They kept the blue ribbon in a tin with buttons and, when a baby cried its first cry in Mercy's hands, they tied the ribbon to the bedpost and let it flutter like a flag that announces no conquest, only survival. Decades leaned into one another until the year calendars decided to name everything twice. People moved. Houses fell. The river forgot and remembered and forgot again. The eelskin ledger traveled like contraband scripture, church floor to attic trunk, trunk to schoolhouse wall void, wall to the pocket of a woman who could not read but could recite the names it carried as if speaking them kept the roof up. One summer when the sun refused to quit, workers repairing the old church found the oilcloth, and a boy with curiosity bigger than his caution slit the ribbon. Pages bloomed on the air like moths. Mercy was gone by then, but Ruth and Tamar, hair white, eyes still sharp, were not. They stood at the threshold and listened while a schoolteacher with shaking hands read the ledger's tidy horrors. He read names that were not Gideon's, songs turned into tables of outcomes, weather described as interference, people described as variables. He read until his mouth numbed. Ruth stopped him with a palm lifted to the sky. "Enough," she said. "We've known the truth longer than that ink has." "What do we do with it?" someone asked, because someone always asks the question that bolts the barn after the horse and the wind. Tamar took the ledger, closed it, and kissed the eelskin like blessing and goodbye. "We testify," she said. "Not to them. To ourselves." They placed the ledger on the communion table and, for one whole night, people walked past it without reading a word, laying instead their own names on the wood, and the names of their people, and the names of lost children, and the names of storms they survived. The ledger listened. Books can be taught. The next morning, a magistrate came with a deputy and talk of chain of custody. The deputy touched the eelskin and pulled back as if pinched. "It's damp," he muttered, though the day was dry. Ruth laughed, not unkind. "That's the river," she said. "It won't let you keep what you won't honor." What became of the ledger after that depends on who tells it. Some say it burned with the church a year later, the fire starting from a candle left dreaming. Some say it sits in a courthouse box with the words "Do not open" written by a clerk who doesn't sleep well. Some say a woman with a blue ribbon in her pocket stitched the pages into a quilt that keeps babies warm with history. I will tell you what Mercy would say: it lives where it needs to. That's enough. Here is what is not rumor. The night the storm taught a house how to count, two cousins, adult women with spines the world tried to bend, stood in a doorway together and said no more. A boy told the truth to a dog until the animal believed him. A midwife stole a book without moving it and planted it where the river could babysit. And a plan with a clean name turned ugly under lightning, then vanished into the part of the past that refuses to be useful to the powerful. Do you think the ledger still exists? Do you think someone will find it when the world is finally ready to stand the sight of itself? Tell me in the comments. If this kept you holding your breath, and you want more buried histories told with the dignity the living and the gone deserve, subscribe to Tales Never Told and ring that bell. Share this with someone who understands that some storms don't drown us, they wash the lies off our names. We read every comment. We carry every story. We'll see you in the next one.